Hi, my name's Adnan Hussain, and I created a short film slash music video called Safar in collaboration with a beautiful piece of music by Sonny Singh and Safar from their incredible album Sangat. The way that the whole project started was with a conversation with Sonny, where he was very interested in exploring and kind of breaking down divisions between communities and kind of ideas that have grown over time. And one of the ways of doing that was certainly by example, by looking back at the example of Guru Nanak and Bhai Mardana from the 1500s, where we have the founder of Sikhism and a Muslim rababi who were great friends and companions through very formative experiences in their lives. And tracing that history seemed to be a really interesting way of telling that story of inclusion and the challenges that created the divisions that we see today. And so, being Punjabi, I have a lot of, thoughts and feelings about all of these ideas. I've certainly done a lot of reading on the subject, but for any project, the start is always a deep dive into academic resources as well as visual resources. And so on the academic side, I was reading papers and histories and taking a lot of notes, thinking about what are those key moments that can tell this story that spans across about a 500-year period from the time of Guru Nanak and Bhai Mardana to present day. And what are those key moments that define the story? Those aspects in particular of the story that maybe are overlooked. For visual references, I started looking at miniature paintings from the time because many of the actual events, in fact, I don't think any of the events that were portrayed from during the lifetime of the gurus themselves are documented in paintings from their time period. So the best that I could find were paintings from the Mughal courts that were from the same time period, which would tell me what types of clothes people were wearing at that time, how landscapes were portrayed, how architecture was portrayed, the kinds of compositions and that sort of play with perspective, and how the size of the characters could be much larger than the architecture if the characters were what was the most important feature of that painting. One of the first things I did was to create some characters and a basic look for the background. So I gave like the background kind of a watercolor look, and I gave the foreground more of a cel shaded look, a little bit more along the lines of some of the miniature paintings that I was looking at. And so, being that I had very limited resources, it was just myself, and I had just a few months to create everything. I started with very rough storyboards, so very roughly drawn, but just figuring out like what are those key moments, how do I want to portray them, and figuring out the timing to go along with at that time what was a rough version of the track from Sonny and Guess. So the next step was to build a modular setup to create characters. So in Unreal Engine, here I'm going to get a little bit more technical. So this video is going to be a mix of like the technical process, which may be interesting to some folks, and then just the design and creative process as well. And so here, for example, are some nodes for creating some blend shapes. So you have a few unique faces that I can blend between to create characters. And there's nodes in here to set visibility for like the headgear, whether it's like a turban or a hat of some kind, or to not have any type of headgear. So there are kind of libraries of each kind of component, including like the clothing that the characters are wearing. And so just creating a system that allowed me to swap each component out. So you can see there's an, and so there's a lot of setup in here, and a lot of what I did, a lot of what I was able to do with these blueprints was really thanks to the work that I had done previously in an Unreal fellowship on gaming, where I really got to push my knowledge of blueprints a lot further. And so that helped me to create, a base character with all these interchangeable parts that was built upon a custom metahuman. So as a metahuman, which is kind of a standardized character that's available in Unreal, I had this amazing facial rig and really good body deformations, but I wanted to create something more stylized where like the hands are smaller and the head's a little bigger and the feet are smaller than what would be anatomically correct, and have some fun with that stylization. And then for the material, I used some cell shading, which didn't allow for opacity in the hair. And so I had to make a lot of adjustments. Like opacity didn't work with this cell shader. And so all the translucency in the skin and things like that, I took the parent materials for these and made them all opaque in order to work with this setup. So there was a lot of just custom setup, thinking of things in a modular way up front. And then even for the clothing, creating these 3 to 4 channel masks where, you just have like an RGB, like these channels separated out. So like the belt is green, the shirt or tunic is red, and the pants or the pajama or shalwar is blue. So by separating these out into separate channels, then it was very easy to be able to customize those colors on a character basis here, where I could choose the belt color and the color of a design on top of the shirt versus the shirt color itself and the pants color, etc. Changing the face texture and all these customizable options that I created in the blueprint. And so with that, then there were several different texture options. So for different costumes on a similar character, like this is a British soldier. And so in Marvelous Designer, I created relatively simple clothing shapes for all the different types of garments. And again, just trying to think about making each piece as reusable as possible. And then for a few designs, there were much more specific details, like for this outfit of a British, commander. I had to get into a bit more detail. A lot of these clothes, I made a few different variations that were based on ideas that I saw in miniatures, but just trying to keep them as simple as possible, and then throwing in a few modern variations for one of the last scenes in the film. But so there's just like a lot of interchangeable parts so that the characters could have as much variety as possible. And so each of these things had to be made, and then the materials that would kind of define the shading properties of the different clothing. Now, because I was working with like a more stylized rendering look, I was able to simplify some of these things down further, but still had to make everything to begin with. And so for the different body types, there were also different types of clothing. And so a lot of this clothing, I had to drape it in Marvelous Designer to simulate like the wrinkles over the character's body. I created different types of dupattas. And so these are all like interchangeable parts. And I could change the colors on all of them using the blueprint. But there's so many different, pieces of clothing and character faces. And then some of the looser garments had to be simulated for every single shot as well. So that meant running a cloth simulation after animating the character so that we could get some nice movement and wrinkles in the draped clothing to give that more life. And creating things like Guru's shawl, for example, required figuring out how to wrap this cloth around the body. And just really thinking about reuse as much as possible. And then creating fewer unique items that were needed for particular characters. And each of the props, was also either a sourced model or just something quick that I put together. And a lot of these didn't really need to have a lot of detail because of the painterly style and because many of these objects were not really going to be viewed very close up. And so that's part of what you get from storyboarding everything in detail beforehand, is knowing how much detail you need to go into for each thing. And so some things like this cannon, these are sourced models that I could grab from like Turbo Squid. So I had to model a lot of different objects, especially ones that were unique to the story, like this rabab. Ended up not using this design. Instead, the design that was more favored was this one, as being more authentic to the type of rabab that was likely used at that time period. and I sourced a model for a sword, and I created a model of a peacock taus. So a lot of the shading and things was pretty simple because I knew that I was going to use a painterly style to finish it all. And I was able to source a model for Sonny's trumpet, so I didn't have to build that. And I also sourced a tank and a train. And then in different scenes, I was able to record motion capture. So I acted out all of this stuff myself. Recorded motion capture using a Rococo suit that I picked up in order to do this project. And it allowed me to do these really nice long takes and split them between the different characters in shots. But at some point, when I got to shots with larger numbers of characters, they weren't really easy to work with in Maya. And I found that bringing them directly into Unreal and applying motion capture to the different background characters and making adjustments to their movement proved to be a lot easier to do within Unreal Engine directly rather than editing and exporting all of that from Maya. So here you can see a lot of the color variations and character variations used within a scene. And I really tried to think of the kind of perspective that miniature paintings are known for. So one of the things that really helped me out to get things back and forth between Maya and Unreal is my custom suite of tools. I have these tools called MG Tools, which is a complete suite of tools for exporting animation, models, rigs, all of that stuff from Maya to Unreal Engine. And so these are all tools that I've written that are commercially available. And in addition to that, I have custom metahuman rig tools. So I have like body controls and face animation export and all of that. And then I have tools for retargeting the motion capture data to my setup. And so that all of these tools really made it much, much easier to just quickly iterate between Maya and then bring that all into Unreal. So here's an example of a train engine. So it was a model that I sourced, but then I had to rig it so that you could get basic movement. It didn't have to be perfect because I knew that it would be kind of flying by the screen pretty quickly and we wouldn't really see it from the side. But just to make sure that we had movement in the wheels that kind of made sense and went with the forward motion of it. So I set up all of that. And there were several train cars. So I had to make sure that all of that could be animated easily. So you have this whole train. And so I just rigged it up in Maya. And I had tools to export as a skeletal mesh or as an alembic or even just transform animation for each of these. And so that really came in handy. And so for some of the other things that I had to model from scratch, I was able to create all these interesting props. So I have like this rabab. And even for this, I use the same sort of RGBA 3-channel, 4-channel maps. If you include like the alpha as another mask, and then did all the material mixing or shader stuff in Unreal Engine. So in Maya, I used my body control rig for metahumans on all the characters and was able to take motion capture that I had created using the Rococo motion capture suit and basically put all these performances together and then take the best part of it and use that in the edit. But by creating it all with familiar tools in Maya was amazing. Exporting using my custom MG tools made it super easy to get all of this set up into Unreal, like getting the camera, the animation, creating a level and sequence, all of that was handled by these tools. And so going back and forth became so much easier because of that. So for this partition shot, there were two parts to it. One was the crowd. The second part of this was the train. So I did those as two separate parts. And then in Houdini, I created a simulation to tear apart the first part of the shot, the crowd portion, as the train was ripping through it. And initially, all the text, I had just had it at the bottom of the screen as kind of subtitles. to give additional context to each of the moments that I was portraying. But I really appreciated that Shruti came in and she had a really great idea. She worked with Sonny on basically designing where and how the text should appear, and we worked on editing it further and reducing it as much as possible while still giving the important information. And I think that really helped a lot in the flow of the film and allowing a viewer to not just stare at the bottom portion for subtitles throughout the story, but to kind of move your eye around as you watch. And this was an idea that I had storyboarded where the sword splits the screen in half. And so that was something I just did in the edit, is I just cut the image in half and slowly shifted things apart. But I mean, I feel like that's the beauty of animation, is just being able to visually show all these ideas. And there's a lot of potential for being able to have a stronger impact in the stories that we tell. And so having the train just kind of rip through the scene was another thing that I had storyboarded. And then at the end, it was a lot of fun to have Sonny, Guess, and Nirinjan featured in this final scene. And so it was a really great collaboration working with Sonny and putting this film together. And I hope to create a lot more films in the future. And so hopefully this gives you a little overview of some of the thought process and like the technical and artistic process of making this film. Hope you enjoyed it and learned a thing or two about it. Thank you.